In October 1971, two people recorded Pink Moon. You know one of them. The other one had been in the room for every Nick Drake session since the beginning. He had been there for 5 Leaves Left in 1969 when the string arrangements floated around Nick's guitar like morning fog. He had been there for Brighter Later in 1970 when the sessions were fuller and warmer and still went almost unheard. And he was there in October 1971 when Nick Drake came back to the studio alone. No producer, no arranger, no band, and made the starkest, most uncompromising record of his career in 2 nights. But Nick Drake didn't make Pink Moon alone. There was someone else in that room. Someone whose name never appeared on the album cover. Someone who shaped the sound of that record and dozens of others, more than anyone has ever been given credit for. His name was John Wood, and this is his story. In the winter of 1964, 2 young engineers decided to open their own recording studio in London. Their names were John Wood and Jeff Frost. John was 24 years old. Jeff was 28. They had both worked at Levy Sound Studios, and they had both learned their craft in the old way, by sitting in rooms with microphones and tape machines, listening, adjusting, listening again. They found a space in Old Church Street, Chelsea. It had previously been a dairy, a place where milk was processed and stored. The ceilings were low, the acoustics were unusual. Most people would have walked away. John Wood and Jeff Frost signed a lease. To finance the venture, Jeff secured a loan with Barclays Bank. The company was officially registered in December 1964, after a name was chosen during what John Wood later described as a swift but inspired telephone conversation between the two of them. They called it Sound Techniques, and they built it largely with their own hands, including the mixing console, which Jeff designed and constructed from scratch. That console, built by 2 young engineers in a converted dairy in Chelsea, would go on to shape the sound of British music for the next decade. When the studio opened in the summer of 1965, John Wood was its studio manager, its chief engineer, and one of its 2 owners. He was 25 years old. In 1966, a young American producer named Joe Boyd walked through the door of Sound Techniques for the first time. Boyd had come to London as part of the American folk revival, and he had quickly become one of the most important figures in the emerging British folk scene. He had recently arranged the recording of the first Pink Floyd single, Arnold Lane, at Sound Techniques. He liked what he heard. He liked how the room sounded. He liked John Wood. What began as a professional arrangement became something closer to a creative partnership. Boyd would bring the artists. Wood would capture them. Boyd looked after the musical direction. Wood looked after the sound. It was a division of labor that suited both men perfectly, and that suited the artists even more. Because John Wood had a quality that is rarer than technical skill. He made musicians feel at ease. He listened more than he spoke. He understood what an artist was trying to do before they could articulate it themselves. Over the next decade, that partnership produced some of the most important recordings in British music history. Fairport Convention, Sandy Denny, John Martin, Nick Drake. Each of those artists sounds different. Each of those records has a different character, and yet there is something that connects them, a warmth, a clarity, a sense of space that is unmistakably the sound of Sound Techniques and the hand of John Wood. John Wood had a philosophy about recording that was unusual for his time. He believed in capturing everything live, in the same room at the same time, guitar and voice together, the natural sound of instruments in a space, bleeding into each other, breathing together. He once said, "I'm not a slave to separation." In an era when studios were increasingly focused on isolating instruments, controlling every variable, eliminating every accident, John Wood was doing the opposite. He wanted the room in the recording. He wanted the air between the musicians. He wanted the sound of people actually playing music together in a real space at a real moment in time. This is why the Nick Drake recordings sound the way they do. The warmth, the intimacy, the sense that you are in the room with him, that the music is happening right now 3 feet away from you. That is not an accident. That is John Wood. He recorded Nick Drake's guitar and voice simultaneously. A single Neumann microphone, a single moment captured without separation, without overdubbing, without correction. The performance and the recording were the same thing. There was nowhere to hide, and Nick Drake did not want to hide. What made this possible was not just Wood's philosophy, but his equipment. The custom Sound Techniques console, built by Jeff Frost with transformer-coupled discrete transistor circuits, had a warmth and a character that no off-the-shelf desk could replicate. The signal path from microphone to tape was as short and as pure as they could make it. And the tape itself, Ampex half-inch running at 15 inches per second, added its own gentle compression, its own warmth, its own slight softening of the high frequencies. Every element of the chain was chosen and maintained with obsessive care, because John Wood understood that the sound on a record is the sum of every decision made in the room, and that most of those decisions are invisible to the person who eventually listens. In October 1971, Nick Drake came to Sound Techniques alone. No producer, no arranger, no band, just Nick, his guitar, and John Wood behind the glass. Nick had not recorded anything in over a year. He had retreated from the world, from almost everyone he knew. What brought him back to the studio, what made him pick up the phone and call John Wood, nobody knows for certain. What happened over those 2 nights is documented in the grooves of Pink Moon. 11 songs, 28 minutes, recorded in the order they appear on the album, with almost no takes and almost no corrections. John Wood later described the sessions as unlike anything he had experienced before. Nick arrived, sat down, played, and left. There was almost no conversation. The music simply appeared as if it had already existed somewhere, and Nick was merely finding it. Wood's job was to stay out of the way and catch it. But Pink Moon sounds different from the earlier albums, starker, more naked, more alone. That is partly Nick Drake and partly John Wood, understanding that this particular record required a particular kind of silence, and knowing exactly how to capture it without interrupting it. There is a quality to the Pink Moon recordings that engineers still talk about. The way the guitar seems to exist in a specific physical space. The way Nick's voice sits just slightly back in the mix, as if he is singing from across a room rather than directly into the microphone. The way the silence between notes feels as deliberate and as present as the notes themselves. None of that is accidental. All of it is craft. John Wood's craft. Nick Drake was not the only musician whose work John Wood shaped at Sound Techniques. And in the years since the studio closed, some of those musicians have spoken about what it was like to work with him. One of them is a British musician named Jamie Marshall, who worked with John Wood at a studio in Clerkenwell, years after Sound Techniques had closed. Jamie came to Wood through a mutual friend, the singer-songwriter Clive Gregson, who had himself worked with Wood on records that John Wood engineered in the early 1980s. Jamie Marshall recalls that Wood had very specific requirements. He insisted on recording to 2-inch tape at 30 inches per second. No digital, no compromise. If the format wasn't right, the session didn't happen. Jamie had originally recorded his tracks on 1-inch 16-track tape. Wood heard it and told him directly, "We need to transfer this to 2-inch 30 IPs." So they did. What Jamie remembers most is Wood's precision as a tape editor, what engineers call a tape splicer, the ability to cut magnetic tape with a razor blade and rejoin it perfectly, editing performances together with an accuracy that felt almost surgical. It was a skill that was already becoming rare when Jamie worked with him. It is almost extinct now. And then there was Mickey Moody. The Whitesnake guitarist came to Jamie's sessions through a pub in Twickenham. He had been watching Jamie play for months, coming to almost every gig. When Jamie told him he was making an album, Moody said yes immediately. He played the entire album for £200. Jamie had to drive him to the studio because Moody had never passed his driving test. He had left school at 15 or 16 and gone straight into music. Jamie Marshall tells this story to illustrate something about that world, the world John Wood inhabited and made possible. It was a world where serious musicians helped each other at mates' rates, where a Whitesnake guitarist would play on a friend's album for £200 because the music mattered more than the fee, where the engineer who had recorded Pink Moon would insist on 2-inch tape not because it was fashionable, but because it was right. Proper old-school skills, Jamie called it, and he meant it as the highest possible compliment. In 1976, Sound Techniques closed. The lease ran out on the old dairy in Chelsea. The studio was sold to Olympic. John Wood packed up his equipment and moved on. He continued to work for decades in studios across London, across the United States, across Europe. He never stopped. He produced and engineered records long after Sound Techniques became a memory, carrying the same philosophy into every new room he worked in. Today, John Wood lives in the far north of Scotland. He is still working, still listening, still making records the way he always made them, with the room in the sound and the sound in the room. His name is not on Pink Moon. The credits on that record list Nick Drake as the artist and Joe Boyd as the producer. John Wood is listed in some pressings as engineer, in others, not at all. But every time someone puts a needle in those grooves, every time they hear the particular warmth of that guitar, the specific quality of that silence, the sense of being present in a room with someone who is making something that will outlast them, they are hearing John Wood. Without him, the records sound different. Without him, perhaps they do not exist at all. Some things don't need a credit to be true. If this story moved you, subscribe. There are more of them, and not one of them ordinary.